Can I take
We're at the high school debate championship at the City Club of Cleveland, and I'm joined again by Jason Habig, who is the debate coach at Hathaway Brown. I've got to ask, how do the students learn to speak so quickly?
Well, I think that the quick talking comes from a few things. One is, these speeches are timed, so they have a lot that they want to cram into a few minutes, and sometimes that they get into their points so much that they speak a little bit faster. It's kind of a double-edged sword, though, because, depending on who your judge is, if they can't follow what you're saying because you're speaking so quickly, you're not going to win the debate. So one of the things that we see throughout the year is our students learn a lot about our judges, and it's a very valuable life lesson to know how to adapt to an audience, and they can tell by looking at the judge and talking to the judge before the debate whether or not they can speak a little bit more rapidly than they normally would.
So know who your judge is. What other criteria are they looking at?
The judges, obviously presentation is important. In this style of debate, the judges are really looking for who better explains and defends their value. So going back to what we talked about before with Lincoln-Douglas debate as a style, the goal is to prove that in this debate, which arguments better achieve justice, and that's what the judges would be trying to figure out based on the opponent's arguments.
Are they looking at things like eye contact and how they're interacting with the audience, or less so?
Some do, less so in this style of debate, really more focused on the argumentation specifically and who wins the argument, not who presents that argument the best.
Again, the topic is resolved. Economic sanctions ought not to be used to achieve foreign policy objectives. How long have the students been preparing for this particular topic?
This topic was selected by the National Forensic League, which is the governing body of speech and debate, for January and February. So they found out about this topic in December. They had a month to prepare. They debated it for 2 months at tournaments on the weekends. And then they chose to use this topic for the City Club debate as it was what they debated at what qualified them to this tournament.
So this is a topic they know well.
They do. These debaters, by the time they've reached this forum, they've probably debated this topic 50, 60 times at least. So they're quite experienced.
So when they get a topic, what's the first? Actually, it looks like we're heading right back to the debate.
Okay. Is everyone ready? Okay, then we'll start on my opponent's case. Okay, my opponent and I agree on the value of justice, but her value criterion of the social contract is insufficient to achieve our mutual value. First of all, because a government can still be acting immorally or unjustly with the goal of protecting its own citizens and preserving the social contract. Take, for example, torture. If we torture people in order to extract information to protect our own citizens, that doesn't make our actions just. The fact is there are other standards that must be used to evaluate justice, as my opponent did concede to in cross-ex. There are other limitations on a government's behavior. But secondly, the social contract only specifies what obligations we have to our own citizens. It never says we don't have an obligation to anyone else. I would contest that we do have an obligation to do things like prevent genocide in the world simply because we're all human, and we have to look to protecting human rights in order to act justly. Okay, now let's look to her first contention. She argues we have no obligation to another nation, but I would say that an obligation to trade does exist when the alternative, or not trading, or using sanctions, causes mass death and suffering. A government, again, has to look to protecting human rights in order to act justly. And when their actions end up harming human rights, that's something we simply ought not do. Okay, and secondly, it's disadvantageous to us as well to use sanctions. It's disadvantageous to the sanctioning country. First of all, because of the high cost. $15 and $19 billion have been wasted on sanctions by the U.S. That severely limits our ability to provide for our own citizens. But secondly, sanctions end up causing a lot of tension on the international level. On one level, tension between the sanctioned and sanctioning country, but also tension between the sanctioning countries and its allies, perhaps allies who would detest our deplorable behavior. So, okay, now let's move on to her second contention. She says here that without economic sanctions, we're consciously adding the capital of threatening nations. But first of all, it's a logical leap to suggest that our supporting of their businesses and people necessarily translates to support of the government. But secondly, the alternative to indirectly supporting this behavior is becoming the perpetrators of human rights violations ourselves. By using sanctions, we actually end up harming people instead of perhaps just indirectly funding that harm. So even if this does cause funding for these human rights violations, the alternative is far, far worse. And finally, in saying that these sanctions are effective in causing regime change, my opponent assumes effectiveness. with a 33 to 50% effectiveness rate, they don't happen to do that very often. But secondly, also because of the rally around the flag effect, sanctions end up strengthening illegitimate regimes instead of actually toppling them. So on that note, let's move on to the affirmative case. My opponent, in attacking my case, admits, even before she starts attacking my contention 1, that sanctions can cause death in other nations. And this is a very key point in the debate, because if they can cause death, and if they end up causing death, even if that death is minuscule, those are still unjust actions. But secondly, when she looks at attacking my first point in my contention 1, she says that we ought to avoid that, but it's not the obligation of the government to do so. But again, we do have an obligation to make sure we act responsibly and take into consideration the consequences of our actions. Okay, against my contention 2, my opponent adds that the threat of sanctions makes them quite effective, but first of all, we're actually looking at sanctions policy itself and not just the threat of them. So we should still assume that the effectiveness rate is about 33%. But additionally, sanctions are even less effective because of 2 things. First of all, the rally around the flag effect, which I mentioned to you in my third contention. But in addition to that, the fact is sanctions in themselves are counterintuitive because we expect them to work to oust an illegitimate government by removing from the people the opportunity to do so. When we sanction goods, that actually ends up limiting the ability of the people to actually oppose their government and try to fight it. So for all these reasons, I continue to affirm.
I'm Eric Wellman, host of WCPN's Morning Edition, joined again by Jason Habig of Hathaway Brown, and he's the debate coach there. Explain where we are now in the program, what's going on.
Well, both competitors have finished their constructives, and Prasan just gave his first affirmative rebuttal, which was his first attempt to respond to Sonja's case and extend through the points of his own speech that he thought were particularly important. The next speech that we'll hear, Sonja will have her final word in the debate. So she'll have a 6-minute speech where she gets to point out for the judges which are those issues that are so important that they're the ones that they should be voting on at the end of the debate. And then after that, Prasan will have one last 3-minute speech where he gets to do the same thing to sum up his main points.
Now, I noticed that when Prasan was talking, Sonja had her head down writing furiously. What's she doing?
She's probably doing 2 things. One is she's flowing, which is sort of the technical term that we use in debate for taking notes. It's a very specific style that we try to teach the students because it helps them have a visual picture of what arguments are going on in the debate, noticing if any of your arguments were not answered by your opponent. This way you can pick up on those things quickly. She's also probably writing notes to herself that she'll use when she gets up and speaks. One of the things that is essential in debate with the time pressures that the students are under, they can't pre-write everything. They must just use a few words here and there off which to speak.
Right.
And that's probably what she was doing.
I know that before this debate started, they flipped a coin to decide who would argue on which side of the issue. Is one side typically easier to argue, affirmative or negative?
It depends on the resolution. When the coaches around the country are voting on resolutions, we try to pick things that are very well balanced. I feel like, having watched a lot of debates on this topic, this resolution is fairly well balanced. There's a lot of arguments to be made for both sides, but occasionally we do get topics where there is an advantage to being on one side or the other.
And I also imagine that they have to prepare very thoroughly for both sides.
They do, because although they flipped a coin for this performance, at most of our tournaments, they'll do 4 or 5 of these debates in one day, and they are required to do one round on the affirmative side and then the next round on the negative side, or vice versa. So they must debate both rounds, sometimes within a 2-hour window.